I'm Deborah Brothers.
And I'm John Paul Jaramillo.
And this is Reading Books Together,
a monthly podcast where we talk about a book we're reading. Let's get into this book. So we discussed last month, we discussed Middlemarch.
Yes.
Where I read a 1,000-page book, and I was very proud of myself, which is a book that was very near and dear to you. And this month, I have cajoled you into reading On the Road, by Jack Kerouac, one of my favorite books from.
Yes, it was your second time to cajole me to read it, actually.
Yeah, so you've read it. You've read it once, and then you told me prior to this that you read the original scroll version, which is great. So we have even more things to talk about, perhaps, maybe. Okay, so let's just get into it. So so I was really sort of impressed by the introduction that you gave Middlemarch and how much you enjoyed that book, sort of going way back into your childhood. And so I would say that, On the Road is a book that I really admire. And I have lots of sort of mixed feelings, contradictory feelings about it. Just sort of like Kerouac was a contradictory kind of person.
How old were you when you first read it?
I think I told you that I read it in high school, and I read it in like an advanced English class. And we had a list of books, like supplemental readings for reports and things. And it was on that list. It was on a list of books that, I'd read all the other books. So that was the only one. So I started reading that, and
did you like it right away?
It might be one of the early books that I really enjoyed reading. There are books where I always associated books with school. And this is a book that I really had a good time moving from chapter to chapter, and the spontaneous prose, the way that it's constructed. And it might be one of the earliest books where I read it, and I felt that, the form of this book is just as enjoyable to me as the meaning of the book. So it's one of those books where I didn't just think it was, just words. I kind of got the idea of how it was structured, and how that kind of created the meaning. And, and it's about young people, and it's about young people getting in and out of trouble. And, so I appreciated that. So this book and Bless Me Ultima is a book that I, was really influential to me. But I guess I liked it because it was kind of a counterculture book. It was about not doing what you're supposed to do, and doing what you wanted to do, and doing what you felt like you wanted to do. And so I sort of appreciated it for that sense. And also, I think I reread this again, like my first or second year of college, because I had Robert Burns for a beat literature class, and we spent quite a few weeks on this book and a lot of other Kerouac books. And then I kind of fully became kind of I don't want to say obsessed, but somewhat obsessed with Kerouac and a few of his books. Like, I really admired The Subterraneans. I really admired Town in the City. I really admired Desolation Angels. So I really admired many of his books and read through many of his books and wrote some papers on it, and felt like it's one of my earliest kind of lit experiences in really enjoying the study of literature and the study of an author. And I think it was because it was, about counterculture. It was about young people having midlife crises. And so, I I liked that because the life that I was living early on, like my first year of college, wasn't all that great, was not studying what I wanted to study. And then I switched to becoming a lit major. And then, so I felt like I was kind of becoming what I wanted to, what I wanted to, doing what I wanted to do rather than what I was told to do or what I was supposed to do. Right. So, and I had a crazy grandfather who liked to travel around without amenities. And so I kind of appreciated that. I appreciate that about it. So the crazy traveling around, my grandfather crazily traveled around in a VW Vanagon, and to see things and to experience things and to fish. And so, I kind of admired that about this book as well. So,
well, I have to say that the first time I read it, I read the novelized form, right? I didn't read it till I was an adult. I didn't read it as a kid. And I was kind of reading it just for you because, I knew it was a book that was important to you. And I did not like it.
It gets a lot of hate.
Yeah, and I didn't like it. I'm sorry, my dog is trying to attack me here. It's you hear noise in the background. Anyway, I didn't like it, but yeah, this time reading the scroll form, I really liked it. And I want to go back and kind of look at the novel form because just to see. I mean, there were things about it that I don't like, but at the same time, I immediately just felt drawn into it this time, which I thought was it was like a 180-degree experience, for me. So anyway, just thought I'd throw that in while you were talking about it.
Yeah, it gets a lot of hate, which we can perhaps talk about. But yeah, I want to say that this might be one of the first books that exists on kind of like a top 100 novels list that I really enjoyed early on. I mean, everything else, it I guess it took me some time to enjoy books like Pilgrim's Progress or Robinson Crusoe. It's like those books felt like or Tom Jones or things that exist on like different kind of top 100 novels lists.
Whether those books are on the top 100.
Those books are on like top English novels. Okay. So I remember that from high school that we had the top 100 like American novels and then top 100 English just as lists. And we would, have you read this? We would go through and discuss what we read and what we haven't read. But, I guess it was one of the first books on one of those lists in my memory that I really dug and I really got into. But okay, well,
sorry. I was just going to say that I talked about the scroll form, and I don't know if there's anybody listening who maybe doesn't know that distinction. Maybe you could talk about that.
So, so the book was published in 1957, and it was his Kerouac's second book. So his first book was published in 1950. And in fact, the idea that he had already published Town and the City is in On the Road, right? And so On the Road takes place over like 6 or 7 years of him going crisscrossing across the country, living in different places and traveling with friends. It takes him, years and years in order to kind of settle down and then to spend 3 weeks typing up On the Road, right? Typing up the manuscript. And then after typing it up, he, walks around with it for several years before it gets picked up. But the original scroll was published not that long ago. Maybe
I think 2007 is what I read.
So not that long ago. And the scroll is the kind of like the just the version that he typed up. I think it's like 120 feet or something like that. It's this long scroll. And so he would tape teletype pieces of teletype paper together and put them into his typewriter so that he didn't have to waste time putting paper, into the typewriter every time he finished a page. And I tell my students he's kind of recreating kind of like the word processor. So he's writing in the 40s and 50s, and so he's like kind of recreating this word processor effect. And for 3 weeks, uh, every night hammers away.
That's basically his first draft of it, right?
It's yeah, so it's a very early draft, and I want to say in my notes that it's all, it has everyone's names in it. So he takes all
Oh
of
yeah, its real name.
he takes all
Yeah.
of his notebooks and types up, the stories. And Walter Sales' version, that's kind of based on Memory Babe, a biography of Kerouac, has it that he's kind of inspired by getting Allen Ginsberg's book, Howl, in the mail, right? So he gets it in the mail and he's like, oh, wow, we're doing it. We can do this, right? And so this great friendship with Allen Ginsberg and Neil Cassady inspires him to type this up. And it's 120 feet long and it doesn't have any L's because the L was broken on the typewriter. Or at least that's the myth, right? And then he, hands it into a big publisher, and it's edited. And so we probably can discuss how the edited version versus the unedited version.
Mm-hmm.
So it's much more than just, he did much more editing than just changing everyone's names, right? For legal purposes. The edited version is wild for that time. I guess it's wild. There's drug use, there's sex, right? There's theft, there's stealing, prostitution, references to prostitution, right? But in the original scroll, it's perhaps, it's even wilder, and it's even more, perhaps there's even more sexual content. So that's the one you read and you really enjoyed.
I did, because it felt, I want to say that it's like the form of it that I love so much, because I like biography. I like nonfiction. I love fiction too, obviously, but I've always been a person who really, really loves nonfiction, especially biography and memoir. And so it reads like memoir, and um, it also just it's just really fast. It just moves. It pulls you right in. You're right into it. And at first it isn't, because there's no scene, but then he starts bringing these little scene elements into it. And of course, there's his great love, Neil Cassady, that, and there's no other word for it. Yes, they're, his friendship with him. But honestly, it reads like he's writing about his great love. And so it's this just kind of wild ride. I don't know how else to say it.
And
And that's why I told you. Now the novel reads like that a little bit to me too when I first read it, because the first thing, of course, my reference is always children's lit. The first thing I thought of was, it reminded me of that man's world that's set up in The Wind in the Willows, and that Kenneth Grahame sets up, and that the friendship between Ratty and Mole, and Ratty going through kind of this midlife crisis, and Mole kind of having this young adult crisis, and looking for this father figure, looking for this best friend, looking for this love, and so Neil Cassady's kind of a cross between Mole and Toad to me, because Toad is absolutely untamed.
so,
And
yeah.
there's the element of being on the road too. They go on, this journey and these trips, and then the river and the wind, how the river and the wind are also these big elements. And there's kind of the same, I don't know, even though I would say in the scroll, maybe not as much as in the novel, what I remember that, but this element of, what's natural, what's not, nature, kind of getting back this preliminary beat movement, which is kind of the preliminary hippie movement in some ways. I mean, it's just fascinating but the first time when I read it, that was my touchstone. It was like, oh, this is just a grown up Wind in the Willows. I don't see that as much in the scroll, of course, because it's that uncensored, I mean, just here it all is right out there, and I'm going to tell it to you as fast as possible. But that energy, I mean, you can't, that's what I picked up on me immediately, was this has a totally different energy to it. It has a totally different feel to it. And I love that. I love this energy. I love this feel, even though I don't love all the content. And I hate of course, the uh, violence against women and disrespect against women and things that, are in there. But anyway.
So yeah, I mean, it's a product. Yeah, it gets a lot of hate. It's a product of the 40s. It's a product of the 1940s. And yeah, it's I hear a lot of, criticism of that. Uh, uh, it's male centric, that it's toxic masculinity. I read lots of critiques of it, but when you read through the scroll, I mean, Allen Ginsberg was, was gay, and Neil Cassidy was certainly bi, and Kerouac was bi in but dealing with it, right? Because he was Catholic, conservative, Republican, and very, patriotic, and but wanting to, in love with his friends,
Right.
figuratively and literally, and Allen Ginsberg was in love with Neil Cassidy. Kerouac was, in love with Neil Cassidy. And so the idea that this whole book is like a love letter to this really macho guy. And not only did he write one love letter to this macho guy, he wrote many, Visions of Cody is another one of my favorite books.
Right.
And it's I introduce it as creative nonfiction because it's just him hanging around with his friends. The Subterraneans is him dating a young African American woman, going to jazz clubs, going around Harlem, right? So a lot of these books feel like experimental in the sense that, they're experimenting with drugs, they're experimenting with experience, they're experimenting with sexuality, they're experimenting with wild travel, and experimenting with writing, wanting to write about wild adventures, and then needing to go out, and have those wild adventures. So the opening of this book very much reads like, here's this mythic figure that all my friends have told me about, and I need experience, and I, kind of selfishly, I need experience to be a writer, and so I'm going to hang around. So I hear that's the biggest kind of complaint, is that he's, I think Kerouac says that he's kind of a unsatisfied white guy, and so he's going out to experience, to experience more of the country, and and to experience more, of things that he had only, read about in college and in high school. But I also think the book, the way that I appreciate the book is he tried these other legitimate tracks, in his life, going to college, being a star football player, going into the military, and none of those things were served him, and none of those things gave him the kind of spiritual kind of awakening that I think he really wanted. And so when he finds this young who's described as a young jail kid, and starts exchanging letters with him, he starts to see the country, see his life as more than just what you're supposed to do with your life.
Well, yeah,
And
they're trying to answer life's questions, right? I mean, at least that's what they say they're trying to do. They're trying to um
well, yeah, and
philosophically answer.
Allen Ginsberg's character, is constantly saying, "Why are you doing this? Why are you traveling? Why are you on this road? What is this all for? What is the purpose?" And I think to Kerouac, it was to serve his writing, but it was also just because of things that he implies, that he doesn't want to devote a lifetime to a factory job like his father, and then his father just dies, right? And so you devote your life to work, and that doesn't seem to be spiritually important or lead to a spiritual awakening. Um, uh, Family, getting married, having children, those things don't seem to. I want to say those are the adult things that society gives you, and like A Portrait of the Artist is a young man, right? He has these choices, and he finds that he wants to be a writer, he wants to be an artist, as opposed to, wants to settle down, which is a big question in a lot of beat literature of like, how should I be, as opposed to what I want to be. And so I love the way that it's presented. Why are you doing this? And he's choosing the irrational. He's choosing to do, he's intentionally choosing, well, there's really no good answer for why we're doing this other than I have this irrational love for travel. I have this irrational love for Allen Ginsberg and Neil Cassidy, and I want to travel around the country to see them as often as I can. So choosing the irrational, I think, is something that I used to talk about in Robert Professor Burns' class, and how society, you try to make the best rational decisions, and then where do those lead you? And so here Kerouac's constantly like, there's no answer. Maybe I just won't answer. Maybe I'll choose I'll choose not to answer, and I'll just kind of feel and wander and see what happens. But, along the way, he's also, more so than a lot of writers that I study, he really wants to be a writer. No one wants to be a writer, I sometimes say, more than Kerouac. And now his journals have been published. Tons of stuff's been published about him. I just read his journals,
Mm.
Desolation Peak, the journals of him volunteering to be a fire spotter, on Desolation Peak in Canada. And everything is just for the experience so that he can get it down in his notebook. And his notebooks are like, I don't know if you've seen the Kurt Cobain documentary, but Kurt
Mm.
Cobain had like opus amounts of notebooks with song ideas and drawings, and that's the way Kerouac was. It was full notebooks full of material where he would literally write, here are my supplies, this is where I'm going, this is what I'm going to do when I get there, here's a long like list of everything that I'll need, and my route. And so I think he really loved to kind of experience his life into his notebooks, and wanted to, you know, um, follow his irrational friends. And like he says at the beginning of this book, that he loves the mad ones, and he
Hmm.
wants to, that he's obsessed with really kind of
Hmm.
eccentric, mad people. And there are lots of references to like fraternity brother college students that make fun of him as he's walking, right? Or legitimate people like normies, like normal people out there who, that work and get married and go to bed at 9. And he's reacting to those kind of people, and he loves his friends who are, some of the most eccentric, American writers
But
of the generation.
sorry, I don't know if it's told in the same way or what in the, because it's been close to 20 years since I read the um, novel form. But yes, he does love, the mad ones. But at the same time, he has this way of showing, at least in the scroll thing, I think, of showing us that everybody's mad. Everybody's crazy. I mean, here he is, he's on the back of this flatbed truck that's being driven by these twin brothers, who are on business for their dad's farm, and they do this, a few times a year, and then they pick up everybody they can pick up on the way. And they're so there's this whole trailer full of people who are traveling for various reasons. There's the guy who's like the hobo who's protecting the younger kid. There's him. There's these other people, and they're all traveling for these different reasons. But these two brothers he describes as like their big white corn-fed teeth, because they're constantly smiling, and blonde hair guys, and how when the men have to pee, they don't necessarily stop. They only stop when they want to stop, and then they yell out, piss call. And so that means that they're kind of under the control of these guys, and they're even though they're always smiling, I mean, that's a pretty mean, mad thing, to do to people, to not, you know what I mean? And to goes into great detail about this guy that, wets himself basically trying to pee off the back of the thing. But
it's very sociological. Like, he loves people. So he's like experiencing
yeah.
all these different people, and he's getting it down in his notebook. And that's from part one. And part one doesn't really have a lot of Neal Cassady. He keeps kind of missing Neal Cassady in part one, but part one kind of shows that that he's just as crazy, right? Like
right.
he hitchhikes. He
absolutely all he eats is apple pie a la mode.
And part two, so part one shows that he's just as crazy, or just wants to travel, rapidly and crazily, as Neal Cassady. And part two, in my notes, kind of shows that Neal Cassady is supposed to be the con man, and he's supposed to be the shy, sensitive writer, right? And so early on, I think it's in part two, or maybe it's in midway in part one, where
I don't know, the scroll's not divided.
You need to teach me how to. Neal Cassady wants to learn how to write, and there's this implication that Kerouac wants to learn how to be more experienced the way, world experience the way that Neal Cassady is experienced. But by part two, like I have in my notes, that he's working in Denver. He's made his way to Denver the way that his friends have gone to Denver. And he's working, and he's seeing that working in Denver is not really leading to anything. And he kind of hustles a woman to give him $100 so that he can go to San Francisco. So Kerouac, is very much set up as kind of like as the opposite of Neal Cassady. Neal Cassady is this, this crazy kind of like sexual being, and Kerouac is not. And Cassady drives like a wild man, and Kerouac doesn't even have a driver's license, and says that he's really afraid to drive. So this kind of like, this kind of opposition, these kind of foils, I don't know what we want to call it, like he's drawn into this world. And by part three, he's referring to Neal Cassady as his brother, and he's becoming very much very similar, and they're traveling together. But I really like part one, even though there's not a lot of Neal Cassady in it, because we have Remy Bencour, who becomes important at the end of the book. But he has all of these friends that he's made before Neal Cassady that he wants to travel in order to see, right? So Remy Bencour is supposed to be this friend that he met in the Merchant Marines, and I forget the guy's real name. I have a list here of like the characters' names versus who they are in real life. But he goes into the Navy. He very quickly gets out, goes into the Merchant Marines, and makes this good friend that he wants to travel across the country to see. And so there is this reference that the money the money that he's using to travel is money that he gets from, he says he gets government check or military check, right? And he's getting money from a publisher from town in the city, right? But Remy Boncourt is the character that tells him, he says, you need to come see the guy who sells, that sells fruit. And Kerouac's like,
Right.
I don't want to go see the guy that sells fruit. And Remy Boncourt says, you will never understand America unless you come and study the guy who walks down the street and yells, right, to purchase fruit. And I feel like he talks about, what the, what what's the meaning of life, what is it that we're all looking for, what is the pearl that the country gives you, and it's people. He's experiencing people, right? And Neil Cassidy is the one that he experiences the most, and that wants, that he wants to be with the most. And he is like this epic hero, but he's also extremely flawed, and introduces him to debauchery, introduces him to threesomes, introduces him to drugs, more and more to drugs, introduces him to more and more irrational behavior, to where he becomes like, by the end of the book, he really becomes like this monster. And all the characters along the way, and I guess that's why he gets knocked, because he's this male figure, and all the women of the novel hate him and say, why, he's a creep, he's going to leave you, and ultimately he does. I think he abandons, they're traveling around crazily, and I think he abandons Kerouac's character Sal 2 or 3 times, through
Right.
the novel. He just kind of like, oh, I'm done traveling, and I'm gonna go settle down with, my current, Joan, my current,
Right.
my current baby mama, my current girlfriend, or whatever, right? And then ultimately, you know, the I think maybe the last straw is Kerouac is in they travel to Mexico, and Kerouac has dysentery,
Right.
and he's extremely sick, and and Neil Cassidy's like, yo, I'll see you later, I gotta go.
Right.
And ditches him. And then maybe that's one of the, the last, the last straw, or the last experience where Kerouac really sort of shows strength in the last portion of the novel, by kind of rejecting Neil Cassidy at the end of the book. And he rejects him at the end of the book for Remy Boncourt, who, and he needs, some of the, I forgot how funny the book is. Like, my favorite part is when Remy Boncourt's character, Remy Boncourt says, come with me to impress my father-in-law, or come with me to impress this father figure. And, because he speaks French, and
Yeah.
and Kerouac, and you speak
Right.
French, and he goes and he just speaks gibberish, and gets drunk himself, and really kind of lets down Remy Bencourt.
Right.
And so by the end of the novel, you get the sense that he wants to make it up to Remy Bencourt. But we talked about this before, before the podcast, that, the central relationships are these male relationships.
Hmm.
And even when he's dating someone, even when he says, I met the love of my life, and it's like one sentence, and
Hmm.
then we go right back to how he feels about Neil Cassidy. So this
Right.
idea that, of that the, that the queer theory reading of this book is that uh Kerouac's not as open about his sexuality the way that Allen Ginsberg was, and that they
Hmm.
were both very much in love with Neil Cassidy, right? That they were both very much in romantic sexual love with, with Neil Cassidy, and that, perhaps Kerouac was too Catholic, too uptight, too conservative, and
Hmm.
Neil Cassidy pulled him out of his shell a little bit. But then by the end of the book, he comes back to serving this other friend of Remy Boncourt and Duke Ellington. I think he has, in my memory, is like, oh, we're going to see Duke Ellington. And even Neil Cassidy can't keep him from that, because jazz music is
Yeah.
infused
That's kind of
in
all
so much
through the
of the.
book. Yeah, yeah, and bebop, and I mean, and he talks about it being like this time period between, you know, um, if I can remember, I know he said Charlie Parker and Miles Davis, but was interesting. Henri, I think, is that guy's name, isn't it? Henri Crew, his real name.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, and jazz music, the form of the book kind of feels like is really rough, like the
Yeah.
way that jazz music sometimes feels rough. And when I teach this in a lit class, I'll use that example, like, not everybody gets jazz or likes jazz. And so I think the way that the book is so rapid and so wild, I do think he's trying to kind of, and there are at least two or three scenes where they're going to see music. They're seeing and he's bonding with Neil Cassidy's character over jazz music. And you kind of get a feel. When I think of jazz music, I think, it's, the pattern is the
Improvisational.
lack of pattern. Yeah, the pattern is the lack of pattern. And it's improvised, and it's kind of maybe it has a center, but it kind of, improvises around that. It has a beat, but it improvises around it. Anyway, yeah. And so
And it also takes everybody really listening to each other and really paying attention to each other to make that work. So I think, jazz is improvisational, yes, but it can go off into ridiculous chaos unless people are really, 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 like you said, there's something that they're all trying to accomplish, and they have to really listen to each other to make sure that that's happening and not chaos. Right. So that's a real literal idea for kind of a thematic thing. But I really think at least the scroll, he felt like it was um I want to say almost like an automatic writing experience or something for him, that it was just something he was kind of dictating rather from somebody else, you know what I mean? That he
he
was
was a
manifesting.
he was a mystic. There are lots of mystical, like mystic moments. I mean, he talks about past lives,
Right,
and he talks about
reincarnation stuff.
he's telling like this woman that he's dating about this really kind of like extended myth of good versus evil, and how there's this big serpent that's going to swallow us, but Dr. Sachs is this is this being, this angel that's going to come and save us. So it's like it's wild craziness. It's kind of like mystic or crackpot kind of mysticism. And it's also just, in places where he's traveled rapidly and crazily and hasn't had enough to eat or to sleep.
Right. Or yeah. Yeah.
And so, yeah, I want to say he was this kind of, crazy. He was as mad as the people that he says, he's just as mad as the people that, or just as eccentric, or just as chaotic. And I think of Kerouac as being a very chaotic life. And I've read lots of articles that said that maybe he played lots of football at a time where they played football with leather helmets, and that he may have had some, and this is a time before, names for, specific head injuries, because he did leave football because of I think it was a knee injury. But
And he only lived to be 47.
and he was Catholic, so he didn't like to go to the doctor all that much. And so he would nurse himself with, his medicine was whiskey. And there's a story where, he had a daughter. So I think he's meeting Joan Kerouac Joan at the end of the scroll. And it's, just a few, he's like, oh, I met the love of my life. And it's just a few lines. But he never really kind of embraced his daughter, Jan Kerouac. And she tells the story where, like, his friends bring her to see him when he's, when he's older in the 60s, when he's in his older, he's in his 40s,
Mm.
and he's kind of self-medicating with lots of whiskey, and not really that he's kind of masking the emotion for his daughter, like again, because alcoholic, and but saying that he's not an alcoholic, that he's just got an old football injury, that he's just sort of self-medicating with, with whiskey. And I think I think that's ultimately how he passed away, because of, alcoholism,
Mm.
something with his stomach. And Cassidy died on the road,
Mm.
traveling across country. I think he died like on the railroad tracks somewhere and on the border of U.S. and Mexico. Um, uh, but these were, yeah,
Yeah.
really hard living people. But I think the country kind of breeds that. I think that's another sentiment in the book, is this idea of being a hobo, and this idea of, which is
And
American,
Americanism.
which
Hmm.
is, I think of Vachel Lindsay, tramping
Hmm.
across America. I think of, even Bob Dylan, wearing the same pair of jeans, traveling across the country, right? And I think of, the many characters in this book. I wish I could remember the character. There's one of his friends who says he sees a hobo when he's a young kid with his mom, and his mom says, or that's a hobo. You never want to be like that
Hmm.
person. And the kid says, oh, I like that idea of
Hmm.
traveling across the country, right? And his mom gets really mad at him, but Neil Cassidy was the son of you know, he was born on the road. He's the son of the old tinsmith. In the edited version, his father's the old tinsmith, and that's one of the only moments in the book where I kind of feel sympathy, because he's going around in the part 3 looking for his father with Kerouac, and they meet some of his family, and his family's like, "We disown you. The family doesn't want to have anything to do with you because of you've been to jail, you don't have status, we don't want to have anything to do with you." Right. And so he can't find his father, and the family that he does find kind of reject him. And that's one of the moments that I think of, that I kind of feel sympathy for him, and also kind of understand that they have this beat generation. They kind of have this, they're outsiders, right? They're these outcasts, and they've created this
Hmm.
family, for good reason, because they're, old Bull Lee is William S. Burroughs, and he's an outcast because he's, on drugs, and kind of out of his mind, and he can't deal. He's not doing well with his family, raising his kids, and then ultimately kills his wife, and
Right.
in Mexico. And so these are wild, crazy people, in the way that human beings are wild, crazy people, and the
Right.
beats are kind of like their own kind of family, and they embrace one another the way that reform school kids do, kind of find their own kind of family. So it's
Yeah. I was just going to say, I think too, something that's worth mentioning is just how young they are when this is taking place. And, you
20s.
know, well, I mean, and Neil Cassidy is like 4 years younger than Jack Kerouac. And so there's like, when he's 35 when the book gets published, but I mean, it's, like you said, it was years before it gets published that that these events occurred. So Kerouac's born in 22, Neil Cassidy's born in like 46 or 26, and they're writing about events that happen when Cassidy's like 20 years old. And it's so they're not like total grown-ups yet. Even
Yeah,
though they're fathering children and getting married, and yeah, I mean, and hustling people and all this crap. I mean, it's
and
just it's
publishing, but Kerouac's
publishing book.
publishing
Yeah.
Town and City with a
Yeah, he was
major
probably like
publisher at a very
25 or
young
something.
age. and then like being very young and then told that it's too much like Thomas Wolfe and it's not its own thing and it's kind of a flop. And you know, then okay, then I want to write something that's not like that. But he's getting a little bit of money from it. He mentions in here, but um, yeah, they're very young, and I don't know. We could talk about how I feel like the World War II generation is a little harder, a little more tougher, than modern generation. But at the same time, they're not because he's burning himself out
Right.
at a very at a very young age. Um, I guess my final thought of why I love this book so much is that I love that it's kind of wild, and I love that it's kind of like it's not on the nose. I don't like fiction that's too much on the nose. I like that it's kind of wild, but I do like the end where we get kind of a this kind of this ethical moment where am I gonna blow off my old friends to leave with Neil Cassidy, or am I going to stay with this girl that I'm going to go on to marry? And should I? And he chooses to be a good friend to Remy Bancourt. But then we get the last section where he just says, you know, Neil Cassidy's as wild as America is wild, and to understand Neil Cassidy is to understand, to understand America, and also just how the best things in life, the ecstasy in life, is to be childlike, right? And to God is Pooh Bear. And I think there's like a really in this embracing of not being childish, because people accuse this of like, oh, these are just these are young people not getting their stuff together, which is true. But I also think there's a really an embrace of being more um being more childlike and being
Mhm.
more sensitive and more sympathetic, because I
And
do sort of
yeah,
buy into that.
and back to the idea of Wind in the Willows, of course, you know, Toad is always getting into all these problems. He's in jail, right? I mean, he gets to jail, he steals things, he and everything. He's total narcissist, and yet everybody loves him. And at the end, of course, it's all everybody loves him and everybody forgives him, and he doesn't really need forgiving because they just love him so much. And of course, he's the most wonderful Toad, and he's I mean, so it's that same thing. It's like
Everybody wants Toad's Wild Ride.
everybody wants Toad's Wild Ride, and Mole and Ratty are living together, right? So it's like that. It really is like Ginsberg and Cassidy and Kerouac with Mole and Ratty and Toad. It really is. God, now I'm talking myself into that again. And and yeah.
The importance of friendships, the importance of
Mhm.
uh family, and what do you do when that family is maybe a little too wild, and
Yeah, but
you have to
making
cut them
your
off.
friends your family, you know,
Yeah.
and
And when your
yeah,
friends and family are
and great
a little
love.
too toxic and you have to cut them off.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you and I talked about Big Sur is how the kind of a reunion of them in their 40s. That's a book about
Well, I've never read that.
um
Yeah, you mentioned it.
yeah, I really it's not his best book. It might be his last book. I forget, because he passed away in 67 in Florida,
69.
69 in Florida.
Mhm.
But I want to say that that's if his last book, if not one of his last books, and it's about kind of being in your 40s, and weirdly, Neil and Joan are living in a house and raising kids, and he's working. And Kerouac is more like the Neil who is traveling because he has money and he can travel, and
Mhm.
he's not really tied down from family because he's not let a family tie him down, because he still is not making grown-up decisions, and he's still wanting to write, and perhaps also feeling the effects of lifelong alcoholism, right? And the most beautiful scene is when Lawrence Ferlinghetti has to tell Kerouac that his cat has passed away. That he's really torn up, emotional about his cat dying. Okay, so shall we take a look at 1-star reviews?
Yeah, whatever you want. That's fine. I just did you say what you wanted to say about the book?
Yeah,
Okay.
we've talked for 30 minutes, so that's all we get. That's
Okay.
our allotted time in life. Um, I'm supposed to like On the Road. Well, I don't. I hate it, and I always have. There are a lot of reasons why I hate it. I find Kerouac's attitude toward the world pathetically limited and paternalistic. That's a good one.
Mm.
I love that a 1-star review has 93 comments and 948 likes. I like Goodreads 1-star reviews. I'm gonna write a book about Goodreads 1-star reviews. This is the book which has given me anxiety attacks on sleepless nights. This is the
Oh
book which
wow.
has glared at me from its high pedestal of classical importance in an effort to browbeat me into finally finishing it. And this is that book which has shamed me into feigning an air of ignorance every time I browsed any of the 1,001 books to read before you die list. It is. It's on a lot of
Wow.
top novels. It might be the only book that's on those lists that we've read in on our podcast.
Hmm.
So it's one of those classics. Ann Charter says it's up there with Mark Twain for what that's worth. Anyway,
Hmm.
I'll read a couple of more. Although the ideas hold a certain appeal, the book is ultimately just a half-assed justification of some pretty stupid, self-destructive, irresponsible, and juvenile tendencies and attitudes. The end result, which is a validation of being a deadbeat loser and a perpetual child.
Hmm.
That's fair. That's fair. That's fair. I believe that. Um, I really don't understand why this book is a classic. I think of it as nothing more than a diary written by a man who was sauced all the time and whose brain could not understand structure and the unwritten rules of writing. It's
Oh.
it's its incoherent rambles go on for days. That's fair. That's
It's
fair.
funny. I mean, I mean, of course I'm talking about the scroll now, but I think that is what I meant when I talked about energy. And that's for me is what made it exciting and interesting. So,
Well, I think they both have that drive. I mean, they're both very
mhm,
quickly paced. A lot happens in just a few pages.
mhm,
And I do think he was a really good writer. I know I always used to get chastised by poetry professors because I would always want to read, Kerouac's poetry.
right.
And I think he could write anything he wanted to. I really do. I think I've read his short stories, I've read his essays, I've read his novels. I've read The Scroll reads like, a journal.
Mm.
And I really think Visions of Cody is just like little, these little image exercises in chapters where, he really loves Neil Cassidy
Right.
and loves New York City because Visions of Cody is all about New
Mhm,
York City. And just, you know, the dirtier, the grimier the restaurant, the diner, the bus station, the place, the more he kind of loves it. So
mhm,
there's more to get down into his notebook. So they're almost like little tone prose poems, if I'm being really generous. And but almost, I mean, he would talk a lot about Walt Whitman, Specimen Days, that he really
mm,
loved this kind of fluid, image driven,
mhm,
poetry driven kind of book. And On the Road's not quite that. It's much more readable than, you know, Specimen Days or like something that's like surreal.
mm,
I do think it's kind of like written, Town in the City he's trying to be Thomas Wolfe, and On the Road he's trying to be, um, you know, something new, something that's more to him. And I also just I love to imitate the way people talk. I know you like to imitate the way people talk.
mm,
We have family that like to imitate how people talk, and Kerouac is really good
mhm,
at imitating,
mhm.
um, the way people speak. And Allen Ginsberg said he was the great rememberer, even
Right.
though William S. Burroughs disputes that because he says that William S. Burroughs is related to rich people, and William S. Burroughs says no, he was not related to rich. Like he says that William S. Burroughs is getting a check from his family and he doesn't have to do anything. And William S. Burroughs famously says, I don't know what he's talking about. I don't get any money from a rich family, but who knows? Okay. So that was a long discussion, a long, formless, rambling discussion. I think Kerouac could approve of that discussion. What are we going to read for next month, Deborah?
Well, it's with your okay. I would like us to talk about your new book that's coming out. And I think that's important for us to kind of look at that. So maybe if you don't mind, like a more formal kind of interview thing too, a little bit, not a long, lengthy, but I would like to ask you some questions about your first two books to kind of set the context for the family stories, and then talk to you about Carlos Montoya that's coming out probably next month. And
we
is
have
that okay?
certainly have read that book.
Yes.
When you're editing a book, I posted that on Facebook. When you're publishing a book, you better love it because you're going to read it 1,000 times. So, yeah, that sounds great.
Okay.
That sounds good.
Then let's do that.
Okay. Thank you for discussing this book with me. And at the end, I'll just say I didn't read Wind. I didn't read Wind.
Oh, that's okay.
We said last time we were going to read 2 books. I've been reading for school, so I didn't.
It's okay. You read Wind in the Willows a long time ago. So.
I did. I read it, but I didn't reread it. I should say I didn't reread it, so I didn't read it this month.
It's okay. I didn't read the right form of On the Road. I read the scroll.
I think Kerouac would approve of that. He was born in March too. He was born in March. He was born March 20-something. I forget.
Cool.
So strangely timely.
All right.
Okay. Thank you for talking to me. I will see you in a month.
Yes, you will. Okay. Bye.
Okay. Bye.